In this video, we will discuss whether living near railroad tracks can cause cancer, the chemical exposure risks suffered by those living near railroad operations, health risks found in these communities, and much more. If you or a loved one lived near or worked on the railroads and subsequently developed cancer, visit lawforpeople.com and contact Gianaris trial lawyers for a free consultation to learn about your legal options. Railroad diesel exposure at home. Many people who live near railroad tracks wonder if constant train traffic could affect their health. Research shows that communities near busy freight lines and rail yards are often exposed to higher levels of pollution, especially diesel exhaust, which the World Health Organization classifies as a known human carcinogen linked to lung cancer. Rail activity can also release other harmful substances, including benzene, fine particulate matter, and other toxic compounds that may impact long-term health. The level of risk often depends on factors like how close a home is to the tracks, how frequently trains pass, and whether large rail yards operate nearby. What research says about living near railroad tracks? Research on rail yards, diesel emissions, and near-source air pollution has raised concerns about long-term health risks for people living close to these operations, particularly where trains pass frequently or idle near residential areas. Occupational exposure versus community exposure. Workers in the railroad industry often face higher, more direct exposure to diesel exhaust, solvents, and other hazardous chemicals during daily operations and maintenance. People who live near rail lines typically experience lower levels of exposure, but over much longer periods of time. Even at lower levels, long-term proximity to busy rail lines or yards can increase cumulative exposure to pollutants like diesel particulate matter and benzene. What this means for people living near railroad tracks. Cancer risk for people living near railroad tracks largely depends on how active the rail line is. Quiet passenger lines typically create far less pollution than busy freight corridors or large rail yards, where diesel locomotives may pass frequently or idle for long periods. Research shows that communities closest to major rail yards face the highest exposure, with risk decreasing as distance increases. The main concern comes from pollutants like diesel particulate matter, benzene, and other toxic compounds released during rail operations, which can pose health risks after long-term exposure. Pollutants and pathways. How rail operations can affect nearby communities. Rail operations can release several pollutants into nearby communities. The most common source is diesel locomotive exhaust, which produces fine particulate matter, benzene, nitrogen oxides, and other toxic compounds linked to lung cancer and respiratory disease. Additional exposure can come from coal dust from freight cars, chemical fumes from transported materials, and in some locations, creosote contamination from older railroad ties. Together, these sources can create multiple pathways for long-term pollution exposure in communities located close to active rail operations. Health risks linked to living near railroad operations. Not everyone who lives near a rail line will experience the same health effects. The risks exist on a spectrum, influenced by how frequently trains pass, the presence of rail yards, and how much diesel exhaust exposure or other dangerous substances reach nearby homes. Some residents may only notice temporary respiratory irritation from diesel fumes. Others, especially those with prolonged exposure in heavily trafficked corridors, face a greater chance of serious cancer diagnoses or chronic disease. Scientific research and regulatory assessments suggest both cancer and non-cancer outcomes may be linked to life near railroad operations. Potential health conditions associated with railroad-related exposures include primary lung cancer and increased risk of developing lung cancer, strongly tied to long-term diesel exhaust exposure. Bladder cancer, linked in multiple studies to diesel emissions and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Kidney cancer, observed in some populations exposed to diesel fumes and occupational pollutants. Colon cancer, with evidence suggesting possible association to prolonged diesel and environmental exposures. Laryngeal cancer, connected to inhalation of diesel particulates and toxic air contaminants. Multiple myeloma, with risk signals in studies involving benzene exposure and similar agents present in rail operations. Cancers from asbestos exposure, historically present in some older railroad industry equipment and facilities. Chronic non-cancer lung conditions such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, chronic bronchitis, and general lung disease, aggravated by repeated exposure to diesel fumes and particulates. Short-term and long-term respiratory irritation, including coughing, wheezing, and asthma-like symptoms in sensitive populations. Together, these risks reflect how repeated, low-level contact with diesel exhaust, benzene, and other byproducts of rail activity can accumulate into serious health burdens for communities near railroad tracks and yards. Can I file a lawsuit if I was diagnosed with cancer and live near railroad tracks? Possibly, but these cases depend heavily on the specific facts. Courts generally require evidence that pollution from nearby rail operations, such as diesel exhaust or benzene, played a meaningful role in causing the illness. Because community exposure levels can vary, successful cases often rely on environmental data, medical records, and expert analysis linking the cancer to long-term rail-related pollution. If you've been diagnosed with cancer and live near active railroad tracks or rail yards, speaking with an experienced attorney can help determine whether legal action may be possible in your situation. If you or a loved one has been diagnosed with cancer or another serious illness after exposure to toxic substances at work or in your community, contact Gianaris trial lawyers today. Our team will review your situation, explain your options, and fight to hold the responsible parties accountable. Call us now for a free consultation and learn how we can help you pursue justice. Visit lawforpeople.com to learn more.